Hi, I'm Matt Crowley. Welcome to Venture Capital Press. This episode is going to be discussing representations and warranties. In very simple terms, what representations and warranties are promises that a company is going to make to an investor, or an investor is going to make to a company, or in the case of an acquisition, a buyer or a seller might make to the other party. So in terms of promises, what are we really talking about? Well, first, let's talk about those two words and try to understand what they even mean. Representations and warranties. A long time ago, there used to be a difference between the two terms, and one of the terms, representations, was supposed to explain a fact that already was in existence or had existed in the past. So the company sold 10 widgets. A warranty was supposed to be a promise that's future-looking, that says that the company's not aware of any litigation and doesn't anticipate any litigation in the future. Aha, that's a promise that is about something that we don't know is in existence today. We're speculating that it's going to be true in the future. These days, most deal lawyers view the two terms as almost synonymous. So you don't need to worry about that as a founder. What you need to be thinking about is what types of promises are you making, how do you confirm whether or not they're true, and what does it mean if you make a promise inside an agreement. So typically when we're talking about a venture financing, the investor wants to know a few things about the company before the investor turns over her check to you. So one, the investor would like to know, does your company exist? So that might sound a little silly, but sometimes people will, especially in Hollywood, will talk about, I'm with Crowley Productions, except there is no Crowley Productions. It's just Matt Crowley. He didn't even bother to form an entity yet. So if the founder wants to confirm that, yes, Crowley Corporation is an actual company that was formed in California or Delaware, that's great. Now the investor feels a little safer. The investor wants to know how many shares were already outstanding before she bought her shares. Would like to know there's no litigation, that you haven't dumped any oil barrels over in the factory plant, that there are no healthcare laws being broken, all of those kinds of things that an investor would want to know so that they aren't exposed to risk. They'd like the company to tell them in writing. Now, if you've started a financing, you may be confused by this, and this happens a lot on the acquisition front. A seller will have the buyer review all of their contracts, interview all of their employees, look at everything they've ever done on their financials, and then the seller's confused because the seller's being asked to say again that there are no problems with the company. Well, it's one thing for a buyer or for an investor to do their homework, called diligence, on a company before they invest or before they make an acquisition. But they want to be able to hold the seller or the founders to their promises and to be able to tell the investor, yeah, you looked at everything we gave you, but we're also telling you we didn't hide anything. There's nothing you forgot to ask. We're going to tell you in writing that, no kidding, these are the facts, this is what's true, and you can invest. Now, what happens if those reps are not true? Well, the consequences would be the investor, while they may have signed the purchase agreement, there may be closing conditions that cause the deal to have to wait a couple of weeks, maybe a month before the deal closes. Maybe a landlord needs to consent to the assignment of a facility before the deal is finished. And so if it turns out that those representations aren't true, then at that point the investor or the buyer in an M&A transaction may decide not to close. So it could cause the deal to fall apart. It's also possible that the investor may find out after the deal that something wasn't true, at which point they will, if they find out that there's a problem, they'll want to hand that problem back to the company and tell them to make it right. This tends to happen more on the acquisition front than on the venture financing front, because investors generally don't sue the company they invested in, because the company they invested in will just use the investor's money to fight the investor. So normally that's not how that works. But on an acquisition, a buyer may decide, hey, we paid $3 million for your business. You forgot to tell us about a couple litigation matters. We're going to hand those back to you. You go fight them. And if the party on the other side of the litigation wins, you need to write the check. We're not paying for that. Or we're going to take it out of money that we continue to owe you in the future. One way or the other, the buyer, the investor want to be protected. Now, you may also hear a term with respect to reps and warranties, short for representation, called joint and several liability. What does that mean? Sounds scary. In a situation where there are multiple parties that are involved in a transaction, you may want to make sure that all of them are making those promises and that all of them will stand behind them. So again, in the acquisition context, if my company, Crowley Corporation, is buying shares of Shmubu Corporation from 5 different investors, Crowley Corporation would like to know that each of those investors stands behind the promise. So instead of saying that only Julie is making the reps and warranties, Crowley Corporation wants to know that each shareholder jointly and severally is making those reps. So that means if there's a problem, I don't have to chase each of the 5 shareholders. I can chase one of them, and they're going to have to chase the other 4 if there's actually a problem. So they're jointly and severally liable to me for the promise that ended up not being true. And in terms of a purchase agreement for a venture financing or an M&A deal, mergers and acquisitions, it may be that when you look at the agreement and you're going to see it could be 10 to 15 pages worth of promises, reps, and warranties, that some of those things will call for a list, or some of those things won't be true. That you do have litigation, the receptionist fell down the stairs and has sued for workers' comp claims. Okay, that doesn't mean that the representation isn't true. What that means is you need to add what's called a disclosure schedule to the purchase agreement, where now you say, with respect to Section 3.5 on we have no litigation, well, we have a story to tell. And on the schedule, you'd call out Section 3.5 and say, Susie Smith, our receptionist, on this date fell down the stairs, and we have a workers' comp claim, and here's the case number. Now you've told the buyer that, and the buyer can no longer come back to you as the person making the promise and say, gee, you broke the promise, we'd like you to pay for it. The correct answer is no. We actually told you, the investor, or we told you, the buyer, about the problem. When you sign the agreement, you accept everything in the disclosure schedule. So now whatever we told you, that's your problem. So as a lawyer, sometimes when I have an unsophisticated client that's giving reps and warranties, they'll be very worried, ooh, we don't want to tell them anything. And I try to explain to them, the disclosure schedule is like a shield. And the more you tell the buyer, the more that the buyer cannot come back to you on. So you don't want to lose the deal, but at the same time, if you tell them about things, now you're not liable and you can sleep better at night. So the disclosure schedule is usually your friend. So on that note, now you have a much better feel for representations and warranties. I hope that you've enjoyed this webinar. Thanks.